In World War I, your main enemy wasn't a German soldier with a rifle. You were more likely to die from pneumonia, dysentery, or gangrene caused by the mud than from a bullet. British Army statistics show that approximately 1/3 of all casualties were non-combat related. Soldiers were incapacitated by diseases and accidents both behind the lines and in the trenches. This is a story not of battles, but of survival in an environment designed for killing. A trench was not merely a shelter, it was an ecosystem where humans ceased to be predators and became prey to microbes, parasites, and the weather itself. Why did the war become positional in the first place? Because machine guns and artillery made open assaults suicidal. Within a few months, romantic notions of warfare, with cavalry charges and colorful uniforms, shattered against the harsh reality of a new industrial conflict. A single Maxim machine gun, capable of firing 600 rounds per minute, possessed the firepower of a company of 80 riflemen. The only way to survive was to dig into the earth. Thus, a forced measure gave birth to an unprecedented new world. Imagine a new recruit arriving at the front lines. The first thing he experienced wasn't heroic shouts of hoorah. It was the deafening, incessant roar of artillery, and the smell, a caustic blend of chloride of lime, rotting corpses, excrement, and cheap tobacco. To this was added the metallic tang of cordite after shell explosions, and the nauseatingly sweet scent of decomposition, which soldiers grimly referred to as the Somme aroma. Sound and smell, these were the first elements that shattered their psyche. Contrary to popular myth, most of the time a soldier wasn't fighting, he was waiting. There were morning and evening roll calls when everyone tensely peered into enemy trenches, anticipating an attack. And then, hours of monotonous work, repairing parapets, digging trenches, standing guard. This experience is perfectly encapsulated by the famous soldier's phrase, 99% boredom and 1% sheer terror. This grueling routine, punctuated by sudden death from a stray sniper's bullet or a random shell, created unbearable psychological strain. Here, war was not an event, but a state of being, a constant backdrop to life. But even this backdrop wasn't static, it changed with the weather, and most often, it was liquid. The mud of the Western Front was not merely an inconvenience, it was a self-contained, all-consuming enemy. This thick, sticky mass, often knee-deep, clogged rifle mechanisms made movement impossible and drowned the wounded who couldn't extricate themselves. In the Battle of Passchendaele in 1917, artillery destroyed Flanders drainage channels, transforming the fields into a viscous bog. People, horses, and even tanks vanished into this quagmire, mixed with human remains. Trenches were constantly waterlogged. Soldiers stood for weeks in icy slush that soaked their clothes and sapped their body heat. Imagine living in a poorly dug ditch during an endless autumn storm, and it continuing for months. Water killed more slowly than a bullet, but no less surely. This gave rise to a specific ailment, trench foot. Due to constant cold and damp, circulation in the feet was impaired, and tissues began to die. Feet would swell 2 or even 3 times their size, become covered in ulcers, and rot alive. When attempting to remove their boots, skin sometimes peeled off with the socks. Without timely amputation, this led to gangrene and death. It was not a rare disease. Over 75,000 cases were recorded in the British Army alone. Command tried to combat this. Soldiers were issued whale oil to grease their feet, and wooden duckboards were built, only to immediately sink into the mud or be shattered by shells. It reached an absurd point. Officers conducted foot inspections, and a soldier showing signs of trench foot could be court-martialed, accused of self-mutilation. These futile measures only underscored how powerless humans were against the elements. In winter, however, this elemental enemy changed its guise. The mud froze, transforming the trenches into icy labyrinths. The ground became as hard as stone, making it impossible to dig shelters or bury the dead. This led to one of the war's most gruesome phenomena. The bodies of fallen comrades, frozen into the trench walls, were used as parapets or steps. They could not be removed until the spring thaw. Thus, death itself became a part of trench architecture. But in this dead city, there were other inhabitants. Those for whom the war became a feast, millions of rats. They fed on soldiers' rations and, more horrifyingly, on the countless bodies in no man's land. Soldiers recounted with horror tales of corpse rats that grew to the size of cats. A single pair could produce up to 900 offspring in a year, and the trenches, with their endless supply of food and shelter, were a paradise for them. They didn't just cause disgust, they carried diseases such as leptospirosis, which caused fever and kidney failure. While rats could be somewhat fended off, another neighbor was impossible to eliminate: lice. They lived in the seams of every soldier's uniform, causing unbearable itching and transmitting what was known as trench fever. This disease incapacitated men for weeks, bringing high fever and agonizing muscle pain. The fight against them became a daily ritual. Soldiers would gather by candlelight, using fire to burn the parasites and their eggs from the seams of their clothing. With dark humor, they called this process chatting. Of course, the root cause of all this was complete unsanitary conditions. Latrines, simple pits, quickly overflowed. Swarms of flies moved freely between the latrines and field kitchens. Drinking water was often delivered in petrol cans, which imparted a disgusting taste. Chloride of lime was added for disinfection, but this only made it even more foul. This was the only way to avoid cholera, but not dysentery. A soldier could survive a gas attack, only to die from a simple stomach upset. Nutrition only exacerbated the situation. The monotonous diet consisted of canned corned beef, jam, and hard biscuits. Fresh vegetables and fruits were almost non-existent. The biscuits were so hard that soldiers broke their teeth on them, earning them the nickname tooth breakers. Some even carved photo frames from them and sent them home as souvenirs. Constant vitamin deficiency weakened the immune system. The body simply had no resources left to fight infections. Then, in 1918, as the war was drawing to a close, a final, most terrible enemy struck the trenches: the Spanish flu pandemic. Weakened soldiers living in cramped conditions became ideal victims for the virus. It killed the young and strong within days. Ultimately, the Spanish flu claimed approximately 50 million lives worldwide, several times more than the combat losses of all countries involved in the war. It was the last and most brutal blow from an invisible army, victorious where bullets and shells could not prevail. However, the arsenal of this invisible war also contained another man-made weapon. On April 22, 1915, during the Second Battle of Ypres, German forces opened the valves of 5,730 cylinders. 170 tons of liquefied chlorine were unleashed. A yellow-green cloud smelling of pineapple and pepper slowly crept toward the positions of French and Algerian soldiers. They had never seen anything like it. It wasn't an attack, but some gruesome natural phenomenon. Panic was absolute. The gas penetrated the lungs and, reacting with moisture, turned into hydrochloric acid, burning a person from the inside. This was a weapon that violated all conceivable rules of war. Soon, the chemical arms race gained momentum. Chlorine, which was visible from afar, was replaced by phosgene. Colorless, with a faint smell of decaying hay, it was a silent killer. Symptoms of poisoning appeared only after 24 hours, when it was already too late to help, but the king of gases became mustard gas. Iperite. This wasn't even a volatile substance, but an oily liquid that evaporated, impregnating the ground, clothing, and equipment for weeks. It didn't so much kill as it maimed. Mustard gas affected any moist part of the body: eyes, armpits, lungs. Skin became covered in horrific blisters, and victims died slowly and agonizingly, essentially drowning in fluid from their own burned lungs. Protective measures developed in desperate haste. They ranged from primitive gauze masks soaked in urine, where ammonia partially neutralized chlorine, to bulky gas masks. These masks hindered breathing and restricted vision. Imagine having to perform heavy physical labor, breathing through a thick straw with fogged goggles on your eyes. The signal gas became the most terrifying sound on the front. The main effect of this weapon was not the number of casualties, but the paralyzing terror it instilled. The fear of an invisible and agonizing death broke the will to resist. A bullet or a shell that offered a chance. Gas offered none. It was heavier than air and behaved like a predator, flowing into craters and trenches, filling the safest shelters and turning them into deadly traps. This was a weapon aimed not at the body, but at the very soul of the soldier. Survivors of gas attacks often remained disabled for life. Chronic bronchitis, emphysema, blindness. Their voices turned into a hoarse whisper due to damaged vocal cords. The gas continued to kill them slowly, year after year, even in peacetime. But even gas wasn't the main killer on the battlefield. That role belonged to artillery. Its psychological impact was no less terrifying than its physical one. Imagine an artillery barrage that lasted not hours, but days. Before the Battle of the Somme in 1916, British artillery fired over 1.5 million shells at German positions in 7 days. The roar was audible in London. The ground shook without stop. A person couldn't sleep, eat, or even think. They sat in a cramped dugout, their only thought, just don't let the next one hit me. This was systematic torture by sound, designed for the complete exhaustion of the nervous system. This endless roar gave birth to a new, terrifying phenomenon, shell shock, what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. For a long time, Command considered it cowardice or malingering, but British psychologist Charles Myers proved that it was a real psychoneurological trauma, an injury to the mind. The symptoms were horrific: uncontrollable trembling, tics, stuttering, sudden blindness or deafness without any physical damage. The mind, unable to withstand the horror, simply shut down, protecting itself from complete destruction. And then, after days of this hell, silence would fall. But it was more terrifying than the roar, because it meant only one thing: the sound of an officer's whistle and the command, "Over the top." This was an order to climb out of the relative safety of the trench and run across no man's land directly into machine gun fire. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the British Army lost almost 60,000 men. Most of them died in the first minutes of the attack. This was not a battle in the classical sense. It was industrial slaughter. In this meat grinder, the soldier's individuality was erased. He became a cog, a replaceable part. Constant proximity to death and dismembered bodies dulled the senses. To avoid madness, empathy had to be switched off. This gave rise to strange, informal truces. In quiet sectors of the front, soldiers on both sides, by unspoken agreement, would not fire at each other during meals or supply deliveries. It was a desperate attempt to preserve the remnants of humanity, which the High Command brutally suppressed. And yet, even in this hell, people sought ways to preserve their sanity. Black humor became their primary weapon. Soldiers gave nicknames to shells, such as whiz-bangs or Black Mariahs. They sang cynical songs, mocking the war. The most striking example was the satirical newspaper The Wipers Times, which British soldiers printed on an abandoned press in the ruins of Ypres. It was full of parodies, dark jokes, and poems that ridiculed generals and the absurdity of the situation. This laughter through tears was not merely entertainment, it was the last line of defense, the defense of the human mind against total madness. The World War I soldier fought not against a single enemy, but against an entire hostile ecosystem. He was like an astronaut landing on an alien planet where the air is poisonous. The soil tries to swallow you, and meteors constantly fall from the sky. He battled mud, water, rats, lice, gas, artillery fire, and his own mind, which refused to accept this reality. The mundane routine killed more methodically than bullets, because it was constant, ubiquitous, and inescapable. The numbers coldly confirm this. In some sectors of the front, non-combat losses from diseases, frostbite, and exhaustion exceeded combat casualties. During the disastrous Serbian campaign, the Austro-Hungarian army lost more men to typhus and dysentery than in battle. In the winter of 1914 to 1915 alone, the British Army recorded over 20,000 cases of trench foot. The environment proved to be a more effective killer than man. The war ended, but the trenches remained with the survivors forever. They returned home with shattered lungs, amputated limbs, and crippled psyches. A generation of men who had learned to sleep under the roar of guns but could not live in silence. In France, they were called les gueules cassées, the broken faces. These were soldiers with horrific injuries for whom Harold Gillies, a pioneer of plastic surgery, created new faces. World War I didn't just kill millions, it proved that the most terrible weapon is the environment that man himself transformed into hell on earth. And the main question it left us with: what happens to humanity when survival itself becomes torture? In the fields of Flanders, tons of unexploded ordnance are still found annually. Farmers call this the iron harvest. Every year, bomb disposal teams in Belgium and France defuse hundreds of tons of these munitions, including chemical shells, which remain lethally dangerous. A century later, the Earth still tries to purge itself of the poison of that war. It is a stark reminder that the man-made ecosystem of death outlived its creators and continues to pose a threat.